All right, we're going to be getting started here in just a few minutes. I hope everyone's been enjoying their National Adoption Conference so far. I'd like to say thank you to Jeanette and her team for putting this all on, putting this all together. There is a good afternoon, Kaya Robinson. There is a Q&A that you guys can type in your questions you might have. Feel free to type them in at any point. Jeanette asked me to leave an extra 20, 30 minutes even to answer those questions. So that's what I will do. And I'll read those questions and then I'll answer them here live. So I won't type back answers, just so everyone is aware. And again, we're going to start here in just I think I'll give it one more minute and then I'll dive in because this is being recorded, so everyone will get the recording as well. Because I think I have a pretty tight schedule I need to stay on as well. I think I'm going to turn my music off. Got it. All right, let's go ahead and get started, guys. So again, welcome to the National Adoption Conference. This is the Supporting Adoptive and Foster Families presentation. I am Bryan Post. I'm so glad to see all of you here, adoptive parents, foster parents, professionals. It's so good to see you, and it's just amazing, in this time of stress that we can still manage to come together in sharing education and inspiration and to get empowered and to spread love and awareness. So I currently run, those of you who don't know me, I've been doing this work for a long time, actually 23 years, and I have done it all over the world, started a company, co-founded a company 20-something years ago called Post Institute with my partner, Christy Saul. And I currently run a wraparound services program for adoptive families in Northern California. So if you are in Northern California and you find yourself in need, feel free to reach out to me and I would be happy to put you in contact with my people to see if there's a way that we can support you. But that is only for Northern California, and it is for adoptive families that adopted within the state of California. Now, to give you a little bit of a follow-up education opportunity, every single day, 5 days a week, sometimes 6, sometimes 7, we do a show on Facebook, on Post Institute Facebook, called Post Daily Dose. And it's the best 10-minute little parenting show on the planet because it's the only 10-minute parenting show on the planet. Now, Christy is currently running the Daily Dose, and I'm usually doing it, but the last couple of years, I've done it without missing a day. I think maybe I've missed 2 or 3 days for the last 2 years, and so I'm taking a little bit of a break. But if you go on the Facebook, Post Institute Facebook page, you will, if you click on the video tab, there are probably close to 800 videos on there that we've done over the last two something years. So there's a ton of education, ton of information that is available to you guys free of charge. Just go find us and follow us on Facebook. Okay, so a big part of what I'm going to do, I want to follow on top of what Sharon talked about when she discussed the 7 core issues of adoption. So I'm going to be really kind of layering on top of that. And I feel like maybe even instead of layering on top of it, I'm going to go underneath it. So maybe talk about the core of the core issues. But one of the big things I really want to emphasize in this presentation today is looking at trauma and understanding trauma. It is a game changer. It is a paradigm shift. All the information I'm going to talk to you about today is a different paradigm of looking at ourselves, understanding ourselves, and understanding the children that we are raising and the children that we are serving. And that comes from a trauma-based place. It's understanding trauma. Now, so many people are talking about trauma these days. My friend Pat O'Brien, he says in his lectures, he's like, Bryan was teaching trauma-informed 20 years ago when no one else was talking about trauma-informed. And now we're talking about trauma-informed, but I believe we have to go beyond trauma-informed. I believe we have to become trauma-responsive. It's not enough to just be trauma-informed, just because you've heard a lecture or you went through a course or a class or certification or whatever, you know about trauma, you have this idea about it. We have to be able to respond to it. And in order to be able to respond to trauma, you have to look at trauma through a trauma lens. So you have to change what you see, what you are literally seeing. And that is the paradigm that we operate from. And the paradigm we operate from is the way we think about things, the way we see things, the way we feel about things. So you have to change that paradigm. And I've always said that if I could create these little glasses and I could if I could create these little FBI type black sunglasses and put a hologram of an infant inside the sunglasses, and when you look through the sunglasses inside each person, you saw the infant. If I could convince you to respond to the infant instead of the body that it is in, it would be a game changer. And that is so much about looking through a trauma lens. It's being able to see that the person, usually the child in this instance that we're talking about, that the child who you are parenting in that moment, the child who's having the behavior explosion, child who's having the challenges, inside that child is a stressed out, scared, overwhelmed baby that experiences all of those core adoption issues that Sharon just talked about. And so we're going to build on that today. So how do we start with this? Let's start by defining trauma. I feel like, well, Bruce Perry says that if you work with children, you have to have a generalist understanding of the brain. I'm going to give you an overview. I'm going to give you a summary of the generalist understanding of the brain. And I really want to encourage you to read more, study Bruce Perry, study Daniel Siegel, study Jeanette. Jeanette-ically has some great books on adoption, and she has some fantastic YouTube videos. Get a generalist understanding, but when you think about this information, I want you to think about it from the capacity of yourself, not your child. So you show up to an event such as this and you've got your child in your mind. You want you want things to be better at home. I want you to think about yourself first, because that which you can see in yourself, you can more readily see in another person. But if you cannot see it in yourself, it's going to be really hard to see it in another person. So think about trauma. I'll give you this really simple working definition of trauma. Trauma is any stressful event. Any stressful event. Now we're talking about adoption. We're talking about foster care. Those are traumatic events. We know these things. But what we don't always realize is that trauma is so much more than these things. And I want to establish this right up front. If you have an adopted child, if you have a foster child in your home, you as the parent have experienced trauma. Not because you have the adopted child, because of the foster child, because there's something in the energy of attraction. And I believe that almost every person in our society has experienced some level of trauma. And if you had not, up until the last 6 months, guess what? You are now living through social, cultural, environmental trauma. This pandemic alone that we've been through. Trauma is any stressful event which is prolonged, overwhelming, and unpredictable. Any stressful event. So imagine the last almost year now that we've been living in this era of COVID and this pandemic and unemployment, and then all the racial tension and the political tension and all the pressure and stress that puts on families. Families have been living in a state of trauma. If you had not experienced trauma up until now, you've been living in it. And the funny thing about that is that 20 years ago, when I first started lecturing, I would be like, we are living in the highest level of stress in our society. Think about where we're at now, 20 years later. Oh my gosh, it's craziness. So trauma is defined as any stressful event which is prolonged, overwhelming, and unpredictable. Now, this is very important. When that event continues on, unexpressed, unprocessed, and misunderstood, that's the difference between a short-term stressful experience versus a long-term, potentially life and brain-altering traumatic experience. your ability or inability to express, to be able to talk about it, to be able to cry about it, to be able to yell about it, be able to process it over and over and over, over and over and over again, express, process, and then make sense of it, is how you keep something from becoming a long-term, potentially lifelong, brain-altering experience. That stressful experience, if you can express it, process it, understand it, it is then a short-term stressful experience. The problem is most traumas in our society, we don't have an opportunity, especially children, they don't have an opportunity to express and process and understand, because expressing, processing, and understanding could span days, it could span weeks, it could span months, it could even span years. Like grief. When you lose someone significant to you, grief is a traumatic experience to your physiology. Well, then what do? You have to cry, you have to talk to people about your loved one, you have to share, and you have to keep doing that over and over and over again, because you are literally repairing your cellular system, the loss within your cellular system. Now, what happens if you don't have anyone to share that with? What if you're an infant and the cry continually gets mistaken as being spoiled? Or you're a 2-year-old and the cry and the whining continually gets mistaken as the terrible twos. And then all of a sudden we start reacting to that individual or to that infant or to that 2-year-old in this really negative way. What if you're a teenager and you're crying, you're expressing, you're processing, comes through as cursing, and it comes through as threatening, and it comes through as depression, and maybe it comes through as running away? What if that's your way to express and process? How do we deal with those things in our society? This is the different paradigm I'm talking about. The different paradigm I'm talking about is looking at these behaviors and looking at these expressions from a lens of trauma, which is a lens of understanding, which allows us to respond from a place of love as opposed to a place of stress and fear and control. So any stressful event which is prolonged, overwhelming, and unpredictable, and when that event continues on unexpressed, unprocessed, and misunderstood, that's how a short-term stressful experience becomes a potentially lifelong, brain-altering, long-term traumatic event. So here's a picture of my sister now. Getting warmed up, gonna have to take my jacket off. Whoo, you guys are getting me going here. Here we go. All right. Okay, so there's me, and then there's my sister. So if you look on the left side, you see me. I was adopted as an infant. My sister was adopted as an infant. I had a lot of behavior problems as a kid. I mean, I wrote a book called The Great Behavior Breakdown. In that book, I basically break down 27 different behaviors, severe behaviors that adopted children have, that adopted and foster families struggle with, that professionals struggle with. So I go through and I break down every one of those behaviors. As a kid, I probably had almost all those behaviors. But the thing is, I had very good, strong social and emotional skills. The thing is, I got along with friends. I was a leader. I got along in school. I got good grades. The teachers loved me. My extended family members loved me. It was fantastic. And then on the other hand, there's my sister. My sister, also adopted as an infant, had hell growing up. She did not get along with friends. Did not get along with teachers. She did not get along in my own family with my parents. It was constant conflict. It's like growing up in World War III. She didn't get along with extended family members. Everywhere she looked, there was always this negativity that was focused upon her. And we were both adopted as infants. Now, why am I sharing this? I'm sharing it because I want you to look at the picture. Now, you may not be able to see it really clear, but I want you to look at this picture of me on this left-hand side. There's a smile on my face. My eyes, there's like these little slits, my fat cheeks. I mean, literally, I look like I am love drunk. I just feel good. I'm just happy. Well, guess what? My biological mother loved being pregnant. Up for 7 months of her pregnancy, she loved it. She ate well, she didn't drink, she didn't smoke, she exercised. I had 3 other siblings, just back to back to back, older than me, and she just loved being pregnant. It wasn't until the 7th month of her carrying me that she knew that she was not going to be able to keep me, and then she went into depression. I grew up, and especially as I've grown in this work, I grew up knowing, feeling that I always had a good in utero experience. it wasn't until those last couple of months that it got really stressful for me. And that's where the roots and some of the origins of my earliest traumas started, was in those 2 months. Those cellular, physiologic, emotional traumas started in those 2 months before I was eventually born and then placed into a couple foster homes before I was eventually adopted by my parents. My mom said, you know, when we first got you, you were smiling. When we first got your sister, she was crying. That defined the essence of our experiences as children growing up in my home. My sister was 3 months premature. 3 months premature. When she was born, she weighed 3.5 pounds. She spent her first 3 months of life, this is in the 70s. She spent her first 3 months of life in an incubator. There's evidence that she was fetal alcohol exposed. When she came out, she was completely stressed out, completely stressed out. So I came to my parents much more relaxed. She came to my parents much more stressed. This starts in utero. In utero. So you're looking at your adopted child right now, your foster child right now, and you're like, hey, I got him when he was 5, or hey, I got him when he was a baby, or hey, he just came to me when he was 15. Why does he have all these problems? It actually starts in utero. As early as the 4th week after conception, the fetus has the ability to hear. As early as the 2nd trimester, the fetus has the ability for psychological processing. The fetus can think. There's a whole lifetime of experience that occurs in the womb. And those memories, those are called pre-verbal memories. All of your children carry those memories. You carry those memories. You as the parent carry those memories. I want you to think, when was the last time you thought about your own birth? When was the last time you thought about your own childhood? See, this is the thing. One of the biggest problems with how we frame helping adopted children and helping foster children, helping children with behavior issues, one of the biggest problems that we have, that we encounter, is that we focus exclusively on the child. And what we fail to realize is that oftentimes the family that the child is going into has its own set of unspoken nonverbal traumas. Each of those parents or those single parents or whoever it is, whatever the makeup is, has their own history. So the problem is we focus all the way on the kids, but we don't focus anything on the experience of the parents. And then when we do that, we end up placing all the blame, all the reactions, all the negative energy is focused geared towards the child. And we're not taking any personal responsibilities for ourselves. So this is very important, because now I'm an adult, right? I'm also a parent. I'm also an adoptive parent. I also work with families all over the world. Guess what? I have my issues. I have my own personal issues. And guess why it's so important for me to understand those? Because those issues and the potential for those issues show up in every relationship interaction. This is something we're going to talk about today. It's so very important. But before I go down this rabbit hole of you thinking about just your child, I want you to realize you have a history too. When was the last time you thought about your birth? When was the last time you thought about your childhood? You had a birth. You were in utero. You experienced pre-verbal memories. What were those memories? Was mom happy to have you in her tummy? Were mom and dad in love? Did they have plenty of money? Did they have plenty of food? Was there plenty of security? Or was mom and dad not in love? Or maybe mom got pregnant out of wedlock, or maybe there was drugs, and maybe there wasn't security, maybe there wasn't shelter. Guess what? All those experiences, all those energies of those experiences are still stored in your brainstem. And guess what happens? When you get stressed, those experiences get stirred up. This, ladies and gentlemen, is the biggest challenge to creating peace in your home. It's not that your adopted child comes with all these overwhelming traumas. It's that your adopted child comes with these overwhelming traumas, which creates stress, which then triggers your stress, which then stirs up your overwhelming trauma. And then everyone in the home is stressed out and feeling loss and feeling rejection and feeling shame and guilt and feeling grief and having identity issues and having intimacy issues and having mastery and control issues. Sharon identifies these as the 7 core issues of adoption related to adopted children. But what happens is they show up in every family, in the entire family, So my sister struggled. She struggled mightily until she was 15 years old. And then she's like, I'm out of here. I don't want to do this anymore. It's too stressful. And she left. She didn't run away. She left. Well, what 15-year-old can really take care of themselves? She's just like every other teenager that I see even today, homeless here in Northern California. They're just trying to survive. She was in and out of jail by the time she was 18. And it just started this long, lifelong process of struggle. And so that's a big part of why I do what I do. But I want you to understand that both she and I grew up in the same home. Both she and I had the same parents, but our experiences with our parents were fundamentally different. They were fundamentally different, number one, because I had a different in utero experience than she had. Now, our parents, before I get off the top of the bus, our parents were both children of alcoholics. Both of our adopted parents were children of alcoholics. My mother watched her father have a heart attack in front of her when she was 9 years old. My dad's dad was shot in a bar. And so both of them grew up with moms who had to take care of 10 and 9 kids. Okay, so both of them were the oldest of the household. So both of them grew up being very parentified and hyper responsible. My dad went on to Vietnam, came back from Vietnam with severe post-traumatic stress disorder. My mom used to say it was so intense that when he first came back and he heard a helicopter flying overhead, he'd hit the ground. This man slept with, this is a big, strong man, worked in a rock quarry for 35 years. This man would sleep with a light on next to his bed because he's afraid of the dark. There was significant trauma in my family that was already present. See, we don't spend enough time thinking about those issues. We don't spend enough time talking about those issues, processing those issues. So that's a part of what we're going to do today. We're just going to pull it all together in this little bit of time that we have together. So there are 2 important terms that I want you to remember. The first one is regulation. Regulation is the experience of stress within your window of tolerance. So you wake up first thing in the morning, hopefully you had a good night's sleep. If you didn't have a good night's sleep, then it impacts your window of tolerance. We all have a window of tolerance for how much stress we can handle. And this is so important. In fact, everything I say to you is critically important, and you need to try to remember it. And you need to listen to it 10 times, but that's going to be really hard to do because we have our old paradigm that says, I'm a product of what I believe and see and feel and have heard and have learned the whole time getting to this place of adulthood. So to be able to think about something a completely different way, that's a lot of work. So it's not always easy to do. I'm going to challenge you to do it because it'll change your life if you'll do it. We all wake up with a window of tolerance for how much stress we can handle. If you had a good night's sleep, which I hope you did, then you wake up, your window of tolerance is wide, it's big, it's strong. So you go into the day, you engage the day, utilizing that window of tolerance. Every one of your children wakes up with a window of tolerance, how much stress they can handle. And the longer, and sometimes for some kids, it's minutes. Their window of tolerance closes within minutes. For other kids, they can get through an hour or so, a couple hours, a few hours. They can even go to school and by the time they come home, now their window of tolerance is too small. So what happens is when you've utilized your window of tolerance and when the stress has gotten too big, the window of tolerance has closed, got too small, then you move into a state called dysregulation. Dysregulation is the experience of stress outside of your window of tolerance. It's when you're stressed out. Okay, this is important. This is life-changing, actually. It changed my life. I read this. I'm gonna read this little scientific, you can see it right there on the screen. I'm gonna read this little scientific finding to you. I read this almost 20 years ago. And I read it in the introduction of Alan Shore's book, Affect Regulation and the Origin of Self. Changed my life. It is believed that affect dysregulation is a fundamental mechanism involved in all psychiatric disorders. It is believed that affect dysregulation is a fundamental mechanism involved in all psychiatric disorders. What does that mean? It is believed that being stressed out is the fundamental cause of all physical, because research tells us that 90 to 98% of all physical ailments are related to stress in the nervous system. Physical, psychological, emotional, behavioral. It is believed that physical, psychological, emotional, behavioral problems are directly related to being stressed out. Directly related to being stressed out. Now think about that. I've been taking this stuff and simplifying it for 20 years. If this is true, if it is true that being stressed out is the fundamental cause of all physical, behavioral, emotional, and psychological issues, if that is true, then what is the thing you need to do next? I'm asking you that question because I know many of you are struggling in your homes right now. And just based off this one little scientific finding, if being stressed out is the cause of your child's problems, it's the cause of your problems, what is the first thing that you need to do? It's the most simple thing in the world. I'm going to tell you, breathe. Breathing is the one most proven way to interrupt your stress physiology. The one proven way. Herbert Benson identified it in the 1970s and called it the relaxation response. But the reality is all he did is study transcendental meditation. So it had been going on forever, but we found the common denominator. He found the common denominator in all the relaxation and all the growth and all the awareness was the ability to breathe. And guess what happens when we get stressed? When we get stressed, we stop breathing. Now you're hearing me, but you're not feeling me. You're not feeling me. I'm telling you something right now, and I need you to feel it, because the biggest limitation to this presentation right here is that it's all cognitive. Like it's just talk. But the essence of what I am telling you is emotional, and it is heart. It is emotional and it's heart. See, the challenges that you're having in your home right now, you think they're from some limitation in what you know or what you don't know in your thinking, in your child's thinking, in their poor choice making. It's not about that at all. The challenge that you're facing in your home right now is emotion, because everyone's stressed out. And when everyone gets stressed out, they get scared. So in essence, the biggest barrier to the peace that you are wanting to find in your home, to the love that you're wanting your child to feel and experience, to the understanding that you're wanting to create, is stress and fear. And what is the first single biggest step you need to take? You need to slow down and breathe. Because when you breathe, Joseph Ledoux says, in times of stress, our thinking becomes confused and distorted and our short-term memory is suppressed. In times of stress, our thinking becomes confused and distorted and our short-term memory is suppressed. So see, here's what I'm doing right now. I'm going down to the root of why we do the things we do and how we act the way we act. And I'm going to give you insights into all of those areas, because that's that generalist understanding of the brain that Bruce Perry was talking about. Now, look at this little brain diagram. Very basic. The first, we're going to start with your amygdala. Your amygdala, let me put my little pin on here. Your amygdala is here in the base of your brain, called your limbic system. It's responsible for fight, flight, or freeze. As soon as your amygdala experiences a threat, it pumps out stress hormone called cortisol. That cortisol passes the pituitary and it hits the hippocampus. So it goes like this, bam. If that is a high level of cortisol, as Joseph Ledoux said, in times of stress, our thinking becomes confused and distorted, because when the amygdala, boom, releases the cortisol, it immediately overwhelms the hippocampus. The hippocampus has the responsibility for creating a clear signal to the prefrontal cortex, which is our executive control center for all of our social and emotional functioning. So your hippocampus has to interface with your prefrontal cortex and send a clear signal. But when you're stressed, your hippocampus gets overwhelmed. So in times of stress, our thinking becomes confused and distorted. So in times of stress, what happens is your hippocampus sends this broken signal to your prefrontal cortex, and then you get this confused and distorted thought process, which then bursts through. All right, and that's irrational. It's irrational thought. But the other thing here that happens is the cortisol overwhelms your short-term memory. So in times of stress, your thinking becomes confused and distorted, and your short-term memory is suppressed. So when you are stressed, your short-term memory turns off. It just turns off. Well, if your short-term memory turns off, guess what? What your accessibility to the pathway of accessibility shuts down to. It shuts down to your ability to remember that the person who was just loving you 5 minutes ago is still loving you. But if your short-term memory shuts off, that accessibility, you can't access the fact that that person loves you. All of a sudden, that person becomes a threat. That person is no longer a safe figure because your short-term memory won't let you access that that person's actually safe. Here's where it gets even trickier and really overwhelming. When that level of cortisol is really high, it stirs your brainstem. When your brainstem gets stirred, then all of those early memories, all the way down, depending on the level of stress, depending on how big the stress is, all of those earliest memories get stirred up. And because they're pre-verbal, you don't have words and you don't have actual memories that tell you why all of a sudden you're feeling anxious and stressed and overwhelmed, because those are pre-verbal. So what you experience is an energy. See, our body only knows two energetic states. Our body knows a thriving state, which is akin to love, and a survival state, which is akin to fear. So when you get stressed, your cellular system constricts into survival. The higher the stress, the more the constriction, the deeper into the brainstem, and the more likely and active the energy that gets stirred. So all of a sudden, this memory that occurred 10 years ago that you've not been able to express, process, and understand becomes a living electrical energetic system in your body and in your brain. You all of a sudden, you are back in that experience of feeling helpless and feeling hopeless and feeling overwhelmed and feeling rejected and feeling all alone and feeling sad and potentially feeling like you are going to die. You are back there in that moment. And your brainstem is releasing all of that, which is then overwhelming the hippocampus more, which is then sending a more distorted signal to the prefrontal cortex, which is then making your thinking even more confused and irrational and distorted. And that's for all of us. That's not just for your child. It's important to understand that for your child, but it's actually more important that you understand it for yourself. Why? Because in times of stress, Joseph Lado did not say, and he wrote a book called The Emotional Brain. He's a New York University neuroscientist. He said in times of stress, our thinking processes, he said our thinking processes, he didn't say in times of stress, our adopted children's thinking processes, our foster children's thinking processes. He didn't say in times of stress, our spouse's thinking processes. He said in times of stress, our thinking processes become confused and distorted, and our short-term memory is suppressed. And that is so important. Because when you get stressed, and guess what stresses you out? Your children's behaviors stress you out and then immediately cause your thinking to become confused and distorted and immediately cause you to re-experience earlier potential traumatic experience and energies, and then you're not thinking clearly. And if you're not thinking clearly, how can you help your child who's in a trauma-based place of stress and overwhelm, how can you help them think clearly? How can you help them feel secure? Because you're an adult? No, because Bruce Perry also says in times of stress, we revert to our earlier emotional developmental comfort zones, which means when you are stressed, you regress. Not just our children, all of us. See, this is human behavior. This is not adopted children. This is not foster children. This is human behavior. This is all of us. When you stress, you regress. When you regress, you are acting from an earlier emotional place. That earlier emotional place is not going to teach your child how to be responsible. That earlier emotional place is not going to teach your child how to feel loved, how to feel secure. That earlier emotional place is actually going to create more stress for your child. Now, let's talk about these 3 pathways of emotional expression. See how we're doing on our time. 12:21. Supposed to start at 11:30. 12 to 1. I gotta go to 1 o'clock. Okay. 3 emotional pathways of expression. So important. We all communicate through these 3 pathways. And here's the thing. The reason we have these 3 pathways is because they help us transition energy in our brain and our body system. We are all just electrical energy. And when you have when anything shows up, another thing Bruce Perry says is anytime we encounter a novel event, we perceive that event as a threat until deemed otherwise. That is so important. Anytime we encounter a novel event, he said he didn't say anytime your adopted child or anytime it's your foster child, he said anytime we encounter a novel event, we perceive that event as a threat until deemed otherwise. Anytime something new shows up on our radar, on our amygdala's radar, it perceives it as a threat and starts releasing stress hormones and cortisol. We have these 3 pathways of emotional expression to help us transition through that energy, like to process that energy so we can then relax enough to then go do what's asked of us to do. So when you are doing dishes, and all of a sudden your spouse, your partner, your child comes in and says, hey, will you help me find this? You go through one of these 3 pathways of emotional expression. They're attitudes, feelings, and behaviors. Now, usually, if you're doing dishes and spouse, partner, or child says, hey, I need you to help me do this, you're like, ugh. It's like the first thing you do in your body. Ugh. Or you roll your eyes, or you're like, can't you see I'm like my hands are in the water and I'm doing, do you want to do these dishes? Because if you want to do these dishes, I'll go look for whatever it is you want me to look for. But until then, you just need to wait. So we have this attitudinal expression that we have to go through. We have to go through it. And then if you can't express your attitude, you drop through to your feelings, right? So all of a sudden, now let's say the person who's asked you to come help them find something says, I don't care that you're washing dishes. I just need you to come help me find this. And you're like, oh my gosh, are you serious right now? Are we really going to do this? Are you going to discount me and disrespect me that much? So blah, 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 all these feelings go. And then what if they argue with you further? You drop into behaviors, right? Oh, I'm not going to help you look for anything. You like splashing the soapy water, and maybe you throw a glass, and maybe you just say, I'm not even going to wash these dishes, and you storm to your room and you slam the door, and you huff and you puff. That's your behavior. Think about these things as children. When you were a child and your parent asked you to take out the trash, how'd you feel? You didn't like it. You got an attitude. But was that attitude okay? No. What'd your parents tell you? Don't you get an attitude with me. You do what I tell you to do. So then you'd huff and you'd puff. And maybe you go to your feelings if you couldn't have this attitude. Maybe were attitudes safe? Was it okay to have attitudes? Usually not, right? So what would you do? You'd internalize. And you'd go to feelings and you'd grumble and you'd mumble, but you wouldn't say it out loud. And sometimes you would, and you'd get hurt. And your parents said, what'd you say? Oh, gosh. Talk about shoving it down. Like you shove it down quick, especially in my home. No talking back. So were you allowed to have attitudes? No. Were you allowed to have feelings? No. And what happens? It drops down to behaviors. If you can't express to your attitudes, you drop to your feelings. If you can't drop to your feelings, you drop down to your behaviors. Now, what happens at behaviors? Was it okay to express behaviors? Absolutely not. Most of the time, they had to be within this range of normal, and this range of okay, and this range of just not too threatening for your parent for you to be able to have this behavior, but usually behavior is not okay. If you can't express your attitudes, you can't express your feelings, and you can't express your behaviors, what are you left with? Anger and depression. Those become your only options. That energy has to come out. If you can't express through attitudes, you can't express through feelings, and you can't express through behaviors, you drop to anger and depression. Anger and depression have to come out, and they always come out through behaviors. Now, here's the thing. Now we're going to switch over to your kids, because you guys are now adults. We're adults. Guess what adults get to do safely? Usually every day, we get to have attitudes and feelings. And sometimes we even get to have behaviors. But kids don't get to have attitudes, and they don't get to have feelings, and they sure better not have behaviors, because if you spend 6 months or longer in anger, depression, and behaviors, anger, and depression, you're stuck in what I call a trauma triangle. When you can't express, when your only form of expression is behaviors, which is an expression of anger or depression, 6 months or longer, everyone's living in trauma. Everyone's living in stress, and a level of stress high enough to become traumatic. I call this the trauma triangle. At the level of anger, depression, and behaviors, that's where you get diagnosis. That's where you get residential treatment. That's where you get medication. That's where you get restraint. That's where you get disrupted placements. That's where you get all the yucky stuff. That's where you get all the painful stuff. Because guess what happens at that level? When you get to that level of anger and depression and behaviors, and you keep re-experiencing that over and over and over and over again, the only thing that is happening is stress and fear is intensifying and becoming a conditioned pattern in the brain. And you know what happens to our heart when we become stressed? When we become stressed, all the blood flows to our heart, because it is a survival mechanism. So the more overwhelmed our thinking becomes, think about this, the more overwhelmed our thinking becomes, the more our heart shuts down and goes into protection. The more we can calm our thinking, the more we can keep our heart open. This becomes so important, because here we are now. You've got this 5-year-old or this 10-year-old or this 15-year-old, and you have gotten yourself locked into these conditioned patterns that say attitudes are not okay. Who told you attitudes were not okay? Well, mom and dad did, right? You just carried it forward. And who told them? Well, grandma and grandpa did. They just carried it forward. That's old paradigm. Old paradigm. So the old paradigm tells you that attitudes are not okay. Why? What does an attitude mean? An attitude means disrespect, right? Now think about that. An attitude, your child rolling their eyes has generational impact that says that means they're disrespecting you. Guess what? I'm telling you, that is not what that means. I am telling you, you don't have to believe me. You don't have to believe me. I've just been doing this for 20-something years all around the world. I am telling you that when your child has an attitudinal expression, rolling their eyes, huffing and puffing, a little bit of back talk, a little bit of sass, it has nothing to do with you and everything to do with their need to transition that energy through their body so they can go and do what you ask them to do. I always say in our society, we ask our children to take out the trash and whistle Dixie while they're doing it. We get completely focused on the whistling the Dixie, the happiness in which they're doing what it is we're asking them to do, and we completely forget that they're actually doing what it is that we ask them to do. We completely forget, because we get so caught up, because we are so conditioned, because our paradigm, our brains have gotten so conditioned to believe that attitudes and feelings are a sign of disrespect. We view attitudes and feelings and behaviors as a threat. Well, guess what? Attitudes and feelings and behaviors have nothing to do with you. It's your child's process to get through the energy necessary to actually go do what it is you ask them to do. I see this over and over and over again. But the problem in our society is we keep suppressing attitudes because we have this distortion that if our children have attitudes, even though we have attitudes as adults, you let your boss tell you something that you don't like and watch you have an attitude. See, we give ourselves these permissions and these graces as adults, but then we turn around in this very hypocritical way and we don't allow our children the same. Because you have your brainstem gets triggered, you get stirred up, you go into survival because an attitude is labeled as a threat. Now, see, there's a great breakthrough here happening. Now, there's the potential for a great breakthrough to happen in this, and it's not going to be easy. And I'm going to tell you why it's not going to be easy, because we back up here to the amygdala. When your amygdala sees a threat, you immediately move into stress and confused, distorted thinking and suppress short-term memory. An attitude is a threat. A feeling is a threat. A behavior is a threat. So what do we do when we feel threatened? When we feel threatened, we do three things. We want to control, we want to suppress, we want to change. Write those three things down. When you feel threatened, when you move into stress, when you move into fear, you want to control, you want to suppress, and you want to change. Anytime you are working towards control, suppress, and change, you are operating from a place of stress and fear. What we want to be operating from is a place of love and understanding. A place of love and understanding allows us to relax. It keeps our thought processes dialed down. It keeps our heart open. It keeps us understanding. It keeps us supportive, and allows us to create a space, a relationship, to allow that person to work through their own process. See, when children in our society, especially adopted and foster children, traumatized children, when they go through this process of having their attitudes, their feelings, and their behavior suppressed, we start diagnosing, we start medicating, we start disrupting placements, we start sending them away, we start getting frustrated with them, and then it just creates a negative feedback loop. Well, what do you have to do? What do you have to, this could potentially end 50% of your behavior problems in your home. If you hear me, a couple of you hear me because I feel it. If you hear me, and if you feel me, this could potentially cut your challenges with your child in half. What do you have to do? Allow them to have their attitudes. And underneath that, allow them to have their feelings. So instead of getting upset with them, instead of getting attitude back with them, instead of expressing your feelings back when they express their feelings, take a deep breath. Say, I hear you. I love you. We're going to be okay. That's all you do. They give you attitudes. They roll their eyes. They huff the puff. They say, I don't like you. I don't like this food. I don't like this house. Take a deep breath. I hear you. I love you. Everything's going to be okay. I hear, deep breath. Why deep breath? Why deep breath? Because I have to calm down my amygdala. That's why deep breath. I have to calm down my amygdala. When I calm down my amygdala, I turn on another structure in my brain called my hypothalamus. What does my hypothalamus do? My hypothalamus releases oxytocin. Oxytocin is your brain's anti-stress hormone. You can't help your child heal if you continue to create stress for them. And your definition of what stress is and their definition are usually completely different things. But guess whose definition matters? Theirs. Their perception of a threat is what matters, not your perception. This is very important. You have to be able to breathe and calm yourself down so you can turn on oxytocin in your own brain, so then you can train your energy and your vibration that turns on oxytocin in your child's brain. Oxytocin is a learned experience. Some of your children do not have healthy oxytocin responses. That's why they cannot calm themselves down. If they are elevated and escalated, and you get elevated and escalated, guess what? You're not helping calm them down. You're just controlling, suppressing, and trying to change their behavior. Why? Because their behavior, your amygdala perceives their behavior as a threat. That's why when people say don't take it personally, it is literally neurologically impossible. It's neurophysiologically impossible because we view behaviors as threats to our survival. So you have to take it personally in the moment because that's what your brain does. But you don't have to continue taking it personally. And if you'll just slow down and breathe, if you'll slow down and breathe, and if you'll turn your short-term memory back on, and you'll remember that you're an adult, you're okay, that you're actually the one with all the control and all the power in the situation. Think about that. In a stressful situation, you as the adult are actually the one with all the control and all the power. Bruce Perry says, foster children, adopted children, children who've experienced trauma have to have a modicum of control. He didn't say we have to have all the control. He said they have to have the control. Guess why? Because if you are able to calm yourself down and you realize that in reality, you have all the control, you have all the power, you can let them have it. You can let them have control because it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter to you because you know the truth. Give them the control because why? When we get stressed out, we need control. Why? Because control ensures our safety and our survival. That's why we need to have control. That's why we become control freaks. We're control freaks because we're always trying to make ourselves feel safe. The person who already feels safe and secure doesn't have to have control. They can just influence. Because in reality, they know they literally have the control and the power because they can influence their brain. And when you can control your brain, you can control what happens in someone else's brain. A stressed out person cannot grow in the midst of a calm person. A stressed out person cannot become more stressed out in the midst of a calm person. It's neurophysiologically impossible. It's negative and positive feedback loops. A negative feedback loop cannot grow in the presence of a positive one. So even in the moment, you're going to take that attitude or that feeling or that behavior, you're going to take it as a threat. Your amygdala is going to fire off. You can train yourself to breathe. You can train yourself to breathe. So we're just talking about attitudes and feelings. I'm not even talking about behaviors. It's a whole nother level. It's a whole nother level of threat. I don't even want you to worry about that. I don't want you to worry about behaviors right now. I don't want you to think about your child's behaviors right now. Some of you feel completely overwhelmed by the behaviors you're having with your child. I don't want you to worry about their behaviors right now. All I want you to do is worry and focus about how threatened you feel by their attitudes and their feelings. If you keep feeling threatened by their attitudes and your feelings, you can never support them in their behaviors because their behaviors are too threatening for you. Now breathe on that for a minute. If their attitudes cause you to get stressed out and overwhelmed, what do you think their behavior is going to do? If their feeling expression, their cussing, their yelling causes you to get overwhelmed, what do you think the behavior is going to do? Let's just work on not getting overwhelmed by the attitudes and behaviors and attitudes and feelings. That means you got to override all those generational brainstem imprints that say attitudes and feelings are disrespect and manipulation and control. Man, when I hear a parent say, well, he's manipulating me. Oh my gosh, the kid's not manipulating you. It has nothing to do with you. He's trying to survive. He's trying to survive. It has nothing to do with you. His attitudes and his feelings is what he's trying to do. He's trying to express in order to transition because he really wants to do what it is you ask him to do. He just in that moment has so much energy that builds up. And because we don't allow attitudes and feelings, a lot of times we'll push him right into his behaviors. And then we say, I told you so. Stop getting overwhelmed by the eye rolls. No one's going to die. No one ever died by some child rolling their eyes. Stop getting overwhelmed by the child talking back or yelling or cursing. Who cares? No one ever died. No one ever had a heart attack because some kid cussed at them or some kid raised their voice. No one ever died. You're not going to die. Take a deep breath. Calm down. Calm down. Take a deep breath. Say, I hear you. I love you, and everything's going to be okay. And you know who you might have to tell that to first? You might have to tell that to yourself. You take a deep breath and tell yourself, I hear you. I love you. Everything's going to be okay. And then tell your child. If you can do that, if you can begin that process, it's a radical process. If you can begin that process, the negative behaviors that you've been having in your home will reduce by 50%. Now, dadgummit, in an hour of visiting, if that's not worth an hour of your time, I don't know what is. My goodness, you got to send Jeanette off a card of thank you because this just changed some lives. Hallelujah! Can I get an amen on a Sunday? All right, stress model. The stress model says, very important. I've been talking about the stress model for 20 years now. I'm going to have to go and let me see what kind of cue. We got questions up here. Hang on just a moment. We got one question. Oh, that's Bruce Lipton. Please repeat the name of the book you referred to about psychology disorders are related to stress. Bruce Lipton, the biology of belief. Bruce Lipton is a cellular biologist. Wrote a book called Biology of Belief. The other part of that quote was from the Atlanta Center for the Study of Disease Control. They said that 80% of disease and disorder is related to stress. Bruce Lipton says 98% of disease and disorder is related to stress in the autonomic nervous system. And then there is another guy, can't just pop in, Robert something or another, wrote a book about stress and zebras. Very good book. So the stress model. If you guys don't have questions, I'm going to keep talking. I've got 20 minutes. If you have questions, I'll stop and I'll answer the question. Otherwise, I'm just going to assume you don't have questions because you're having amazing breakthroughs in your life and in your heart and in your psyche right now. In your home, you're seeing your child transform before you, and there's just no questions. You're just ready to go get after it. Here's something. Here's one way I want you to look at your child. I also want you to look at yourself, especially if you identified yourself as having trauma. Your child is stress sensitive and fearful. Stress sensitive and fearful. That's such a profound way of shaping and reframing the way you see your child. Stress sensitive and fearful. They're because of their trauma experiences. See, trauma makes the amygdala very sensitive. So we get really sensitive to stress, and you can experience stress through 9 different pathways, not just the 5, 9 other pathways. There's intuition as a pathway. Did you know intuition is a sensory pathway? Digestion is a sensory pathway. Movement is a sensory pathway. Temperature is a sensory pathway. These are all sensory pathways that we have. And then there's the other: sight, sound, hearing, smell, touch, taste, all those. So it's like, any of those pathways can cause your child to get overwhelmed. And when they get overwhelmed, that amygdala, depending on that level of stress, that amygdala stirs the brainstem. When that brainstem gets stirred, all this electrical energy gets stirred. And all that electrical energy is energy of survival. All that electrical energy is energy I'm going to die. When your child is misbehaving, right under the surface is the feeling that that they are going to die. That's why they can't trust. Yes, they had these losses early in life and these perceived rejections of not being good enough, and they have this grief, they have all that. But right underneath their behavior is this feeling of being right back in that place of helplessness and overwhelm. See, that's what generates the shame. So when Sharon talks about loss, I'm going to back up for just a moment. Back up just a moment. Go back to the brain. Come on, slides. There. With adopted children and foster children. See, foster children they haven't been adopted yet, but they've had loss. See, the loss gets stored in the brainstem. The energy of the loss gets stored in the brainstem. That's very important. The rejection, the cellular rejection, because all of a sudden you lose the connection with the biological figure. So there's this disruption. So it's this energy of rejection gets stored in the brainstem. This grief, this loss this unmitigated loss that you cannot repair because you're a child or because you're an infant and you have no way of fixing it and making it better, and filling this gap that you feel in your soul gets stored in your brainstem. And then what happens is when you get stressed, that energy, those energies get stirred up, and that's what makes you that's what changes your thinking. That's what makes you so freaked out. That's why your kids act so crazy, because all of a sudden this energy of loss, this energy of rejection, this energy of grief. I say to parents all the time, stop telling your child that you're going to send them away. Stop telling your child that if they don't behave, they're not going to have a home anymore. Stop telling your children that you're going to undo the adoption. Stop being a freaking sociopath. Grow up, okay? Stop being an adolescent. because that's all you're doing. You're getting stressed out, you're feeling helpless, and you're saying very hurtful, very wounding things to your children. So breathe and slow down and take responsibility. Take adult responsibility. Own your own stuff. Do your own trauma work. Look at your own history. Ask yourself, yes, my child is acting out right now, screaming and yelling, is all frustrated. What is it about that behavior that really stresses me out? Why am I getting so stressed out over that? Because two people can look at the same behavior and one will not react or respond the way the other does. So ask yourself, why am I doing this? John Bowlby, father of attachment, said the threat of loss is equal to loss itself. You want to send your child into a grief reaction? Reject them. Threaten to reject them. Threaten to send them away. Tell them they're not good enough. You put them right back into a helpless infant place. A helpless infant place. All these things get buried in the brainstem. So stress stirs up this energy, shame and guilt. When an adopted child gets stressed, it triggers the shame, because the shame is that I'm not good enough. The shame is that I'm going to be rejected. Right? So the energy takes on the identity. If this unit, this family unit, so if this biological person didn't want me, and now this family unit is stressful and is constantly rejecting, not consciously, but unconsciously, the unconscious energy of rejection shows up when we are stressed. When you are stressed, you emotionally abandon your child. You're no longer present. When you become stressed, the energy of emotional abandonment shows up and the child feels it, just as if you had walked away. Tiffany Fields, researcher at University of Miami, did the study with infants. The energy of a depressed and stressed out parent walking towards her infant looked exactly the same as a healthy parent walking away from her infant. So all of these experiences, intimacy, right? These are all the things, that the core challenges that Sharon talked about, the core issues. Intimacy. When you're in survival, you can't have intimacy. When you are in survival, you are constricted. When you are stressed, you are constricted into survival. You can't allow intimacy because it's too vulnerable. I work with adults. Now I work with families and anytime. It doesn't matter why I'm in the home, what the adopted child is doing. I always work with the family and I always start with the parents. Just the other day, I sat with a young couple who has no intimacy, yet they're trying to create a foundation of security in their home for this 16-year-old adopted child who came to the mom when she was 10 after 10 years of pervasive sexual abuse and neglect. And so now this couple is trying to create security for the 16-year-old, but they have no security within their own dynamic. It's just strange, but it happens because we don't look at these things. We don't look at these things as family dynamics. We don't look at these things as who's really responsible for teaching in the home. It's the parent, right? Us parents, we're ultimately responsible. We got to do our own work. So the stress model says all behavior, this changed my life. Changed my life, it's going to change yours. All behavior arises from a state of stress. In between the behavior and the stress is the presence of our primary emotion. There are only two primary emotions, love and fear. Those are your only two primary emotions. It's through the expression, the processing, and the understanding of the fear that you can calm the stress and diminish the behavior. What I'm telling you, I'm gonna back up here. All behavior, you gotta remember this, all behavior, when your child is behaving, guess what it does? It causes you stress. And that stress drives your fear. And that fear drives your behavior towards your child. Then you forget Because stress causes confused, distorted thinking and suppresses our short-term memory, you forget that all behavior, that your child's behavior is being driven by their stress. That stress has the capacity 9 times out of 10 to tie into their trauma. When that stress ties into their trauma, their behaviors are manifestations of their trauma. This is so important. Your child's negative behavior is a manifestation of their trauma. If you want to help your child through their behavior, you have to calm the stress. You have to calm the stress, because the stress reduces the fear and increases the capacity for love. And the capacity for the love diminishes the behavior. It's not about the behavior. It's about the stress and the fear. If you will conquer the stress and the fear, and you'll start with yourself, you can conquer your child's stress and fear, and their behaviors will reduce. They will reduce. You have to realize that when it comes to wounded children, and you have a wounded child, and you may be a wounded adult, when it comes to wounded children, their behaviors are manifestations of their wounds. And then when you punish the behavior, which is a manifestation of the wound, all you're doing is intensifying the stress and the fear. And then you're going to get stuck. That's why children grow older, but they don't grow better. Because ultimately, we don't do anything to create more love. We end up creating, in the times of stress, we end up creating more stress and more fear. And that's the thing, it's in the time of stress. When you guys aren't stressed, which is probably 80% of the time, you're probably not even stressed. But it's the 20%. See, when your child is misbehaving, that's when you have the greatest window into their wound. That's actually where you want to be. You actually want to be in your child's stress. You want your child to be misbehaving. Why? Because they are giving you windows into their opportunity for healing. If they're not misbehaving, then you don't have access. You don't have access to that brainstem. When they're misbehaving, now that's when you have the opportunity to create a positive, reparative, therapeutic experience in the midst of the negative behavior. But the key is you got to calm yourself down. You've got to breathe. You got to keep your thinking calm. Bruce Lee says, one of the best lessons you can learn in life is to master how to remain calm. I couldn't agree more. Let's see, what else we have? We have 8 minutes. Here's my parenting continuum. So these are the most common things we do, the reactivity and fear side, timeout, isolation, spanking, consequences, behavior modification. Now, this is where the questions all pop up, right? Because you can listen to everything I've said. You can listen to everything I've said. You'd be like shaking your head and praising the Lord. Like, you know, somebody got the Holy Ghost. I think I felt him in their living room. And then I say all of a sudden, you can't spank it, you can't give consequences. You're like, what? Oh my goodness, what did you just say? Because here's the thing. Timeout, isolation, spanking, consequences, behavior modification, points and rewards, yelling, restraint, medication rather than modification of environments, relationships. What do they all have in common? They all create more stress. And if you create more stress, you create more fear. And if you create more fear, you create more negative behavior. And you reinforce the trauma. But you got to give a child consequences in order to teach them responsibility. No! Giving a child a consequence is a reaction to an action. Giving a child a consequence is a lack of taking responsibility. It's a lack of the parent's willingness to take responsibility. You don't punish someone to teach them responsibility. You take responsibility to teach them responsibility. So when you give a child a consequence, it's because you're not willing to take responsibility for the situation occurring to begin with. Well, what's the difference? Well, you can take a child to the store and you can say, get in the basket, you little thief. Or you can say, you know what, when we go to the store, it's really stressful. See, this takes a little bit more time. It's really stressful. In order to keep the stress down, I'm going to have you get in the basket. That way you don't need to take anything because you won't be stressed. I can take care of it. See, it's just a fine line. It's a fine line between love and fear, but the difference makes all the difference. Makes all the difference. Spanking. Don't spank. The rod and the staff are used in raising a sheep, not for beating children. Don't spank. Don't spank. Don't spank. Don't spank. Guess what? The definition of discipline is to teach not to punish. If you want to teach your child, make sure they're in a clear state of thinking, so their short-term memory is turned on, so they can learn. Instead of doing time out, which is sending the child away, do time in. Bring the child into you. Bring them into you for 10 minutes or 20 minutes and tell them, when you feel better, you can go back and play. Bring them in close to you. Affection. Touch your children. Hug your children. Why can you not touch and hug? Because you're stressed. And when you're stressed, you don't want to touch and hug because your cellular system constricts into survival. So you got to breathe. You got to calm yourself down so you can be more affectionate. Okay, here you go. You can go to feartolovebook.com, feartolovebook.com, and if you pay shipping and handling, I will send you a copy of my best-selling adoption book to your doorstep. In addition, I'm going to give you the audio to it. I'm going to give you the audio. In addition, I'm going to give you a 1-hour webinar for the cost of shipping and handling. There's not a single person who watches this who should not have this book. It will change your life. So I had one question pop up. Which of your books discuss the idea you shared about helping your child heal when they say, bam, just got you there. I'm a clinical supervisor, wraparound team in Southern California. You got it right there, Kaya. feartolovebook.com. We share it with all of our families, And if I can support you and your wraparound team, please let me know. Be happy to do that. All right. There is no fear in love, but perfect love drives out fear. This is very important. There is no fear in love. Love and fear cannot coexist. There's either one or the other. I want to encourage you. I want to support you. I want to inspire you to see fear, breathe through it, calm it down, and allow yourself to move into a space of love and be in a space of love. Love is the most powerful healing force in the universe. Most powerful healing force in the universe when we can access it. People are all the time talking about love is not enough, love is not enough, love is not enough. It's because we don't know what love is. We have been conditioned. We have been conditioned to experience fear disguised as love. That's what we've become conditioned for. Fear disguises love. So what we think is love is not love at all. It's actually fear. Now, when you really examine this, and when you really look at it, and when you really watch it within yourself, when you shine a radical light upon your own fear, you will shift into love. And there are no limits in the light of love. In any given situation, we all have two choices. We can continue to react from our old blueprints of stress and fear and overwhelm, or we can stop, we can slow down, we can take 3 to 10 deep breaths, and we can choose love. I hope for you and your family that you will choose love. I hope this has been helpful for you. I hope it's been beneficial. I hope it's been enlightening. You can learn more about me and the work I've been doing for the last 20 years at postinstitute.com. I want to tell you, get that book, feartolovebook.com. Everyone needs to have it. Go to postinstitute.com. Follow us on Facebook. God bless each and every one of you. Enjoy the conference. Send Jeanette and her team big kisses, big love, and until we meet again, God bless you.